History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 5 The Making of the European Age. Chapter 4 Europe's Assault on the World. There was a striking change in the world history after 1500, and it was quite without precedent. Never before had one culture spread over the whole globe. Even in prehistory, the cultural tide had seemed set towards differentiation. Now it began to turn. Even by the end of the 18th century, the essentials of what was going on were evident. By then, European nations, including Russia, had already laid claim to more than half of the world's land surface. They actually controlled, or said they controlled, about a third of it. Never before had those sharing one particular civilization managed to acquire for their own use so great a territory. The consequences, moreover, had already begun to be shown in irreversible changes. Europeans had already transplanted crops and animal species to begin what was to be the greatest reshaping of ecology ever to take place. To the Western Hemisphere, they sent populations which, already in 1800, constituted new centers of civilization, equipped with European institutions of government, religion, and learning. A new nation had emerged from former British possessions in North America, while to the south, the Spanish had destroyed two mature civilizations to implant their own. To the east, the story was different, but equally impressive. Once past the Cape of Good Hope, where something like 20,000 Dutch lived, an Englishman traveling on an East Indian man in 1800 would not land at European colonial communities like those of the Americas unless he wandered as far, of course, as Australia, just beginning to receive its settlers. But in East Africa, Persia, India, Indonesia, he would find Europeans coming to do business and then, in the long or short run, planning to return home to enjoy the profits. They could even be found in Canton or in very small numbers in the closed island kingdom of Japan. Only the interior of Africa, still protected by disease and climate, seemed impenetrable. The remarkable transformation thus begun, and to go much further was almost entirely a one way process. Europeans went out to the world, it did not come to them. Few non Europeans other than Turks entered Europe except as exotic imports or slaves. Yet the Arabs and Chinese were by no means unskillful sailors. They had made oceanic voyages and knew about the compass, while the island peoples of the Pacific made long sea crossings on their mysterious errands. Nonetheless, the ships which came around the Horn or the tip of Africa to Atlantic ports were European and homeward bound, not Asiatic ones. This was a great transformation of world relationships, and it was the work of Europeans. Underpinning it lay layer upon layer of exploration, enterprise, technical advantage, and governmental patronage. The trend seemed irreversible by the end of the 18th century, and in a sense, so it was to prove, even if direct European rule was to dissolve more quickly than it was built up. No civilization had been more rapidly and dramatically successful, so untroubled in its expansion by any but temporary and occasional setbacks. One advantage possessed by Europeans had been the powerful motives they had to succeed. The major thrust behind the age of reconnaissance had been their wish to get into easier and more direct contact with the Far East, the source of things badly wanted in Europe, at a time when the Far East wanted virtually nothing Europe could offer in exchange. When Vasco da Gama showed what he had brought to the king, the inhabitants of Calicut laughed at him. He had nothing to offer which could compare with what Arab traders had already brought to India from other parts of Asia. It was indeed just the legendary superiority of so much of the civilization of the Orient that spurred Europeans on to try to reach it on some more regular and assured basis than the occasional trip of a Marco Polo. Coincidentally, China, India, and Japan were at something like a cultural peak in the 16th and 17th centuries. The land blockade of Eastern Europe by the Turk made them even more attractive to Europeans than they had been before. There were huge profits to be made and great efforts could be justified. If the expectation of reward is a good recipe for high morale, so is the expectation of success. By 1500, enough had been done for the business of exploration and new enterprise to be attacked confidently. There was a cumulative factor at work, as each successful voyage added both to knowledge and to the certainty that more could be done. As time went by, would be profits for the financing of future expansion. Then there was the psychological asset of Christianity. Soon after the establishment of settlement, this found a vent in missionary enterprises, but it was always present as a cultural fact, assuring the European of his superiority to the peoples with whom he began to come into contact for the first time. In the next 4 centuries, it was often to have disastrous effects. Confident in the possession of the true religion, Europeans were impatient and contemptuous of the values and achievements of the peoples and civilizations they disturbed. The result was always uncomfortable and often brutal. It is also true that religious zeal could blur easily into less avowable motives. As the great Spanish historian of the American conquests put it, when describing why he and his colleagues had gone to the Indies, they thought to serve God and His Majesty, to give light to those who sat in darkness, and to grow rich as all men desire to do. Greed quickly led to the abuse of power, to domination and exploitation by force. In the end, this led to great crimes, though they were often committed unconsciously. It sometimes brought about the destruction of whole societies, but this was only the worst aspect of a readiness to dominate which was present from the outset in European enterprise. The adventurers who first reached the coasts of India were soon boarding Asian merchantmen, torturing and slaughtering their crews and passengers, looting their cargoes and burning the ravaged hulks. Europeans could usually exact what they wanted in the end because of a technical superiority which exaggerated the power of their tiny numbers and for a few centuries turned the balance against the great historic agglomerations of populations. The next Portuguese captain after da Gama to go there provided a fitting symbol of this by bombarding Calicut. A little later, when in 1517 the Portuguese reached Canton, they fired a salute as a gesture of friendship and respect, but the noise of their guns horrified the Chinese, who at first called them Folanki, a remote corruption of Franks. These weapons were much more powerful than anything China had. There had been long guns in Asia, and the Chinese had known about gunpowder for centuries before Europe. But the technology of artillery had stood still there. European craftsmen and metallurgy had in the 15th century made great strides, producing weapons better than any available elsewhere in the world. There were still more dramatic improvements to come, so that the comparative advantage of Europeans was to increase right down to the 20th century. This progress had been and was to be, again, paralleled in other fields, notably by the developments in shipbuilding and handling, which have already been touched upon. When combined, such advances produced the remarkable weapon with which Europe opened up the world, the sailing ship, which was a gun carrier. Again, evolution was far from complete in 1517, but already the Portuguese had been able to fight off the fleets organized by the Turks to keep them out of the Indian Ocean. The Turks had more success in the Red Sea, in whose narrower waters the oar propelled galley, which closed with its enemies to grapple and board, retained more of its usefulness. Even there, though, the Portuguese were able to penetrate as far north as the Suez. The Chinese war junk would do no better than the rowed galley. The abandonment of the oar for propulsion and the mounting broadside of large numbers of guns enormously multiplied the value of Europe's scanty manpower. This advantage was clear to contemporaries. As early as 1481, the Pope forbade the sales of arms to Africa. The Dutch in the 17th century were very anxious to keep to themselves the secrets of gun founding and not to allow them to pass into the hands of the Asiatics. Yet, pass they did. There had been Turkish gunners in India in the 15th century, and before they reached China, the Portuguese were supplying the Persians with cannon and teaching them how to cast more in order to embarrass the Turks. In the 17th century, their knowledge of gun founding and gunnery was one of the attractions which kept the Jesuit fathers in favor with the Chinese authorities. Yet, even when, as the Dutch feared, the knowledge of up to date gun founding penetrated Oriental societies, it did not offset the European advantage. Chinese artillery remained inferior in spite of the Jesuits' trainings. There was more to the technological disparity of Europe and the world than mere know how. One of the assets Europe enjoyed at the beginning of her era was not only new knowledge, but an attitude to knowledge different from that of any other cultures. There was a readiness to bring it to bear upon practical problems, a technological instinct for the useful. In it lay the roots of another psychological characteristic of Europeans, their growing confidence in the power to change things. Here, perhaps, was the most fundamental difference of all between them and the rest of the world. Europe was open to the future and its possibilities in a way that other cultures were not. On this confidence would rest a psychological advantage of the greatest importance. Even in 1500, some Europeans had seen the future, and it worked. Africa and Asia were the first targets against which Europeans' advantages were deployed. In these continents, the Portuguese led for a century and more. They figured so largely and were so successful in opening of routes to the east that their king took the title Lord of the Conquest, Navigation and Commerce of India, Ethiopia, Arabia, and Persia, which sufficiently indicates both the scope and the eastern bias of the Portuguese enterprise, though slightly misleading in its reference to Ethiopia, with which Portuguese contacts were small. Penetration of Africa was impossible on any more than a tiny and hazardous basis. The Portuguese suggested that God had specially set a barrier around African interior with its mysterious as and noxious diseases, which were to hold Europeans at bay until the end of the 19th century. Even the coastal stations of West Africa were unhealthy and could only be tolerated because of their importance in the slave trade and the substructure of long range commerce. The East African stations were less healthy but they, too, were of interest not as jumping off points for the interior, but because they were part of a commercial network created by Arabs, whom the Portuguese deliberately harried so as to send up the cost of spices passed by way of the Red Sea and the Middle East to the Venetian merchants of the eastern Mediterranean. The successors of the Portuguese were to leave the interior of Africa alone, as they had done, and the history of that continent for another 2 centuries was still to move largely to its own rhythms in the obscure fastnesses of its forests and savannas, its inhabitants only coming into corrosive and occasionally stimulating contact with Europeans at its fringes. It is also true, though, that the opening of the European age in Asia showed that none of the powers concerned was, in the first place, interested in the subjugation or settlement of large areas. The period down to the middle of the 18th century was marked by the multiplication of trading posts, concessions in port facilities, protective forts, and bases on the coast. For these, by themselves, would assure the only thing early imperialism sought in Asia: secure and profitable trade. The Portuguese dominated this trade in the 16th century. Their firepower swept all before them, and they rapidly built up a chain of bases and trading posts. 12 years after Vasco da Gama arrived at Calicut, the Portuguese established their main Indian Ocean trading station some 300 miles further up the western Indian coast at Goa. It was to become a missionary as well as a commercial center. Once established, the Portuguese Empire strongly supported the propagation of the faith, and the Franciscans played a large part in this. In 1513, the first Portuguese ships reached the Moluccas, the legendary Spice Islands, and the incorporation of Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the islands as far south as Timor within the European horizon began. 4 years later, the first Portuguese ships reached China and opened direct European trade by sea with that empire. 10 years later, they were allowed to use Macau. In 1557, they obtained a permanent settlement there. When Charles V gave up to them the rights which Spain had claimed as a result of exploration in the Moluccas, keeping only the Philippines in the Far East and renouncing any interest in the Indian Ocean area, the Portuguese were in possession of a monopoly of Eastern Empire for the next half century. It was a trading monopoly, but not only one of trade with Europe. There was much business to be done as carriers between Asian countries. Persian carpets went to India, cloves from Moluccas to China, copper and silver from Japan to China, India, cloth to Siam, all in European ships. The Portuguese and their successors found this a profitable source of income to offset some of the costs of Europe's unfavorable balance of trade with Asia, whose inhabitants long wanted little from Europe except silver. The only serious competitors at sea were the Arabs, and they were controlled effectively by Portuguese squadrons operating from the East African bases, from Socotra at the mouth of the Red Sea, where they had established themselves in 1507, from Ormuz on the northern coast of the entrance of the Persian Gulf, and from Goa. From these places, the Portuguese expanded their commerce eventually to trade into the Red Sea as far as Massawa and up to the head of the Persian Gulf, where they established a factory at Basra. They had also secured privileges in Burma and Siam, and in the 1540s were the first Europeans to land in Japan. This network was supported by a diplomacy of agreements with local rulers and the superiority of Portuguese firepower at sea. Even if they had wished to do so, they could not have so developed their power on land because they lacked men. So that a commercial empire made not only economic sense but was all that could be created with the means available. Portugal's supremacy in the Indian Ocean disguised fundamental weaknesses, a lack of manpower, and a shaky financial base. It lasted only until the end of the century and was then replaced by that of the Dutch, who carried the technique and institutions of commercial empire to their furthest point. The Dutch were the trading imperialists par excellence, though in the end they also settled to plant in Indonesia. Their opportunity arose when Portugal was united with Spain in 1580. This change provided a stimulus to Dutch seamen now excluded from the profitable re export trade of Oriental goods from Lisbon to Northern Europe, which had been mainly in their hands. The background of the 80 Years' War with Spain was an additional incentive for the Dutch to enter areas where they might make profits at the expense of the Iberians. Like the Portuguese, they were few, barely 2 million people, and their survival depended on a narrow base. Commercial wealth was therefore vitally important to them. Their advantages lay in the pool of naval manpower, ships, wealth, and experience built up by their ascendancy in fishing and carrying in northern waters. While commercial expertise at home made it easy to mobilize resources for new enterprises. The Dutch were assisted too by the simultaneous recovery of the Arabs who took back the East African stations north of Zanzibar as Portuguese power wavered in the aftermath of the Spanish Union. The first decades of the 17th century therefore brought the collapse of much of the Portuguese Empire in the East and its replacement by the Dutch. For the first time, too, the Dutch established themselves in Pernambuco, the sugar producing region of Portuguese Brazil, though they were not able to retain it. The main objective of the Dutch was the Moluccas, a brief period of individual voyages, 65 in 7 years, some around the Straits of Magellan, some around Africa, ended one when in 1602, at the initiative of the States General, the government of the United Provinces, there was set up the Dutch United East India Company, the organization which was to prove the decisive instrument of Dutch commercial supremacy in the East. Like the Portuguese before them, the company's servants worked through diplomacy with native rulers to exclude competitors and through a system of trading stations. How unpleasant the Dutch could be to rivals was shown in 1623 when 10 Englishmen were murdered at Amboina. This ended any English attempt to intervene directly in the spice trades. Amboina had been one of the first Portuguese bases to be seized in a rapid sweeping up of Portuguese interests, but it was not until 1609, when a resident governor general was sent to the east, that the reduction of the major Portuguese forts could begin. The center of these operations was the establishment of the Dutch headquarters at Jakarta, renamed Batavia in Java, where it was to remain until the end of Dutch colonial rule. It became the center of an area of settlement where Dutch planters could rely upon the company to back them up in a ruthless control of their labor force. The early history of the Dutch colonies is a grim one of insurrection, deportation, enslavement, and extermination. The trade of local shippers and of the Chinese junks was deliberately destroyed in order to concentrate all sources of profit in the hands of the Dutch. The spice trade to Europe was the center of Dutch attention and was a huge prize. It accounted during most of the century for over two-thirds of the values of the cargoes sent back to Amsterdam. But the Dutch also set about replacing the Portuguese in the valuable East Asian trade. They could not expel the Portuguese from Macau, although they sent expeditions against it, but succeeded in setting themselves up in Formosa, from which they built up an indirect trade with the mainland of China. In 1638, the Portuguese were expelled from Japan and the Dutch succeeded them there. In the next 2 decades, the Portuguese were replaced by the Dutch in Ceylon too. Their successful negotiations of a monopoly of trade to Siam, on the other hand, was overtaken by another power, France. This country's connection with the area was opened by accident in 1660 when circumstance took three French missionaries to the Siamese capital. Thanks to their establishment of a mission center and the presence of a Greek advisor at the Siamese court, there followed a French diplomatic and military mission in 1685. But these promising beginnings ended in civil war and failure, and Siam again moved out of the sphere of European influence for another 2 centuries. In the early 18th century, there thus existed a Dutch supremacy in the Indian Ocean and Indonesia, and an important Dutch interest in China seas. To a remarkable degree, this reproduced the earlier Portuguese pattern, although there survived Portuguese stations such as Goa and Macau. The heart of Dutch power was the Malacca Strait, from which it radiated through Malaysia and Indonesia to Formosa and the trading links with China and Japan, and down to the southeast to the crucial Moluccas. This area was by now enjoying an internal trade so considerable that it was beginning to be self financing, with bullion from Japan and China providing its flow of currency rather than bullion from Europe as in the early days. Further west, Dutch were also established at Calicut, in Ceylon, and at the Cape of Good Hope, and had set up factories in Persia. Although Batavia was a big town and the Dutch were running plantations to grow the goods they needed, this was still a littoral or insular commercial empire, not one of internal dominion over the mainland. In the last resort, it rested on naval power and it was to succumb, though not to disappear, as Dutch naval power was surpassed. This was clearly beginning to happen in the last decades of the 17th century. The unlikely challenger for Indian Ocean supremacy was England. At an early date, the English had sought to enter the spice trade. There had been an East Indian Company under James I, but its factors had got bloody noses for their pains, both when they tried to cooperate with the Dutch and when they fought them. The upshot of this was that by 1700, the English had in effect drawn a line under their accounts east of the Malacca Strait. Like the Dutch in 1580, they were faced with a need to change course, and so did they do. The upshot was the most momentous event in British history between the Protestant Reformation and the onset of industrialization, the acquisition of supremacy in India.